What's up, everybody? Blessed be. My name's Manon, and you're watching Witch in the Working, where we will be discussing all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. So, I'm wearing the horny hat this evening because my favorite Sabbat is right around the corner, and in honor of the Autumnal Equinox, bang, I'm sporting it. Don't do it often, but I'm gonna do it today. So, anyhow, again, this Sabbat that I dare speak of is called the Autumnal Equinox, or Mabon. So let's clear up this little conundrum between the Autumn Equinox and Mabon. So from what I understand, this Sabbat has always originally been called the Autumn Equinox, but then, circa 1973, Llewellyn, the book publishing company, hired one Aidan Kelly to write a few books on the Sabbats and asked him to please give names to a few of the holidays, the Autumn Equinox being one of them. Kelly did a little research and decided to tag the Autumn Equinox after the Welsh God Mabon. And there you have it. The Autumn Equinox is now called Mabon by a large portion of the pagan world today as we know it. Unfortunately, some witches and pagans today take offense to the title of Mabon. What's new? Someone always has to take offense to something. Get over it, people. Time is short, and as far as I'm concerned, if this was such an issue, it should have been handled 50 years ago, not sometime recently. So, that being said, roll the intro. Welcome back, everybody. So, as I mentioned, this is one of my favorite Sabbats for many reasons, including one that I live in steamy, hot-ass South Florida, and this Sabbat marks some of the first days where the possibility of cooling off is finally just around the corner. On top of that, we have Samhain coming up and Halloween, which I love, Thanksgiving, my birthday, and of course Yule, where lots of presents go around, and I like presents, so sue me. Anyway, also, bottom line is, I just love the darker half of the year. So, Mabon is named after the Welsh god who symbolizes the male fertilizing principles throughout the Welsh mythology. Many mythologists equate Mabon as the male counterpart to the goddess Persephone. Mabon, like its counterpart, the spring equinox or Ostara, is a day of equal balance between light and dark. The ancient Celts and the English both acknowledged this equality of night and day, but it was not really made into a holiday until the Norse invaders brought it into fruition and placed it as the second harvest between Lugnasad and Samhain. Because this added a third harvest, and in fact the triple goddess was prominent in these conquered lands, the natives of these lands accepted this addition with open arms, as it just reinforced their affinity with the number 3, that to them represented the act of completeness. After this night of balance, darkness will begin to overcome, and the nights are for the first time finally longer than the days until Ostara arrives. So, in the world of the so-called patriarchal religions, this is the time of year that sparks dread and fear throughout their masses, as the darkness is not understood and her mysteries are misunderstood. However, to us pagans, we embrace the darkness as we understand the balance that darkness has with the light, and that we cannot have one without the other. They're each half of a whole, and neither one is inherently good or bad. At this time, the old horn god is preparing himself for his sacrificial death coming up right around the corner at Samhain. The goddess at this time is still heavily pregnant with the god, awaiting to be reborn at Yule to carry on the turning of the wheel, eternally turning round and round. Just to give a little taste of the Autumn Equinox, or the time around this part of the year from other cultures, in China they have a day around this time called Chengchuao. This day to the Chinese marked the end of the rice harvest. In Judaism near this time, a holiday called Sukkot is celebrated. Sukkot holds a lot of pagan roots in its foundation, and it's often observed by building a temporary dwelling outside, and it's decorated with fall vegetables, and all the meals are eaten there during the festivals. And of course, in the old Rome, the Festival of Dionysus was celebrated around this time, and the festivities lasted for as long as the partiers could stand up, basically. In Ireland, Scotland, and Cornwall, it became customary during this time to visit cairns, which are burial mounds to honor dead ancestors, particularly female ancestors. This practice was believed to be twofold in origin. As one, it was believed that if they visited the dead and appeased them, then during Samhain, when the spirits would visit, they'd be more friendly toward the living. The second origin may have been in ancient Ireland, where a cult of female ancestor worshippers based its beliefs on the notion that upon death, all human souls were reabsorbed into the wombs which bore them, and therefore only women inhabited the Tir na Nog, the Irish land of the dead, also known as the land of women. Women were the ones required to decorate and adorn the graves at the fall equinox, while the men prepared the nearby feasting site. By many of our ancestors, cemeteries and cairns were feared, as it was believed that spirits and entities were able to run loose, ready for the haunt, so to speak. However, during the equinox, because of the equal balance of light and dark, creating a sort of equilateral cross, it was safe to approach and dwell within these locations, as a natural protection was created from the evil spirits. Many times fires were carried in gourds, similar to our present-day jack-o'-lanterns, to scare away any evil spirits. So let's get into talking about the fall equinox being the second harvest. So nuts, grapes, apples are all part of the autumnal crops that are harvested around this time. The autumn equinox, in fact, marks the end of the second harvest, and the majority of the crops have been harvested by now. Many of the berries that were harvested earlier are now made into jams, jellies, and wines. In some cultures, such as in Scotland and Wales, portions of wine were poured onto the ground as a sacrifice to the god that he may live until Samhain. This was also done to honor the aging goddess, that she may move swiftly into her crone stage. It was a symbolic pouring of blood unto the earth, so to speak. Drunken debaucheries and orgies figured in prominently in ancient Rome, Greece, and Germanic lands, and were a common practice, of course, heavily involving wines that were created from the autumn grapes harvested earlier. Most everyone is familiar with the famous German Oktoberfest that are in full swing throughout the different countries around this time of the year. Today there are even Bavarian festivals called Nuwaz Wine, which translates to new white wine, a milky, potent substance that is in fact an alcoholic byproduct of the distillation process. When this special beverage is distributed, it's not ever sold by the bottle, but instead handed out by the glassful from old stoneware crocks resembling tall cauldrons. The milky look of this wine connects it with the mother goddess who's entered into her coronage at the fall equinox. Our friends the Celts really didn't have the well-known lands for growing grapes and what have you as the more southern lands and neighbors, but they too figured out a way to compete and join in with the winemaking culture. Instead of using grapes, the ancient Celts used the herb heather instead. Though the end product doesn't hold the same sacred importance as that of the grape wines further south, it's still a tribute to the bounty of nature and still honors and coincides with the equinox. Another ingenious wining strategy developed by the Celts, especially those around Ireland, was a wine made from blackberries, where this berry is especially sacred to the goddess Brigid. So wine is and always has been very special throughout human history, as these fermented juices have always been sacred and known as the drink of the deities. Throughout history, many cultures limited the making of wine to only the priestly classes, and even further, so sometimes limited to only certain time periods. This was to ensure that the wines were blessed correctly towards certain local deities or particular gods and goddesses of a chosen pantheon. In fact, this is where the Jewish law comes into play and insists that the wines were made kosher, as to guarantee that no pagan deity was accidentally or intentionally assigned or blessed to a particular batch of wine being distributed. To this day, they carefully guard the making of their wines, which are dedicated to their own version of God. There was a festival called Harvest Home that was celebrated by the old Celtic culture that most likely at one point fell on the autumn equinox. This festival celebrated a break in the hard work of the harvest and pushed forth a celebration of thankfulness. The autumn equinox is often referred to as the Witches' Thanksgiving, and in fact is one of the oldest harvest celebrations in Europe. It's most likely more of a realism that the pilgrims that brought forth Thanksgiving into the United States and Canada did so more out of the need and want to celebrate their pagan ways than that had been developed from or grown from the fondness of any religious impulse. In actuality, the first Thanksgiving that came into play had many detractors amongst the Puritans, as they could see the close ties to the pagan harvest rite practices they were so familiar with. The harvest home festivities and activities very much resemble that of our present-day equinox practices. For instance, the crowning of the harvest king and queen is a major activity that takes place for both celebrations. Upon the choosing and crowning of the harvest king and queen, these two lucky people become the vessel of the god and goddess to reside in during the celebrations, with honor and blessings. Some other similarities that take place between the original harvest home and autumn equinox are grain threshing, cider pressing, and of course feasting and dancing. As a pagan, whether solitaire or with a coven, it's totally acceptable to put together your own Thanksgiving during this time. This is a prime and powerful time to give thanks to your fertility and harvest deities that have supplied you with their abundance and fruitfulness throughout the year. Maybe even create some of your own prayers to honor them in your own special way. Even at the traditional American or Canadian Thanksgiving, which takes place respectively the 4th Thursday of November for the US and the 2nd Monday in October for Canada, if asked to say the traditional prayer before the feast, if others are okay with it, work in some of your pagan beliefs and words. I personally used to get asked all the time at my mom's house when I would go there for Thanksgiving to do the prayer. So I honestly think I was only asked this much because I actually knew some sort of prayer over everyone else at the table, so they'd have me do it. We most always say, this food is the blessings from the gods to our bodies. Let us partake of it freely and always remember that all that we have we share with those who have nothing. This always went over quite well, and depending on who was at attendance, I could easily slide in God instead of gods, and the whole thing sounded non-pagan, so it worked out. Regardless of whether you'd set forth a prayer by yourself or with a group, it should always come from your heart, as well as any thanks that you wish to bestow upon the gods and goddesses at the Thanksgiving meal. Cheers. Oh, also, being the nature-loving mystical pagans and witches that we are, you should always save a portion of your drink and food to offer up as a gift and sacrifice to the gods and goddesses and nature herself. This is easily enough done by placing this food outside for local wildlife to consume and partake of. Another commonly super cool thing to do at this time is to bring some food and donations to your local homeless shelters and what have you, for as my prayer said earlier, all that we have we share with those who have nothing. So many pagan themes and traditions also begin to focus on death at this time of the year and during the fall equinox. Usually this focus is at a climax for Samhain, but it definitely begins its reflections and preparations as of the fall equinox. In many parts of the world, we begin to see the changes in the leaves and weather, and we begin to see death knocking on the door all around us. Soon the aging god will pass into the Summerlands, crossing the veils at Samhain. For many of our witchy pagan peoples, this is a time to reflect on the power and transformation of death that quickly approaches. As we as pagans see death tremendously different from the masses, as we see it as a time of the ever-turning wheel that we live, die, and are reborn again over and over and over again. To many of us, death is simply the beginning. For those of us who want to celebrate the fall equinox but sort of hide the pagan meaning and symbolisms from our family and friends who aren't, as understanding, there are many hidden festivities you can put together to accomplish this. One such circumstance is to throw an old harvest farm barnyard themed party and decorate your home and surroundings with fruits and vegetables from the fall. This particular practice celebrates the completion of the harvest and was quite popular amongst the colonized lands by the Europeans. You can also simply just throw a first of fall party, have all the foods and wines that are in correspondence with the fall season, and instead of watching sporting events, maybe play some games that will feature fun harvest type themes, and if you're really edgy, maybe feature some of those ancient Roman and Greek drinking games. Going off the lead of that theme, you can also host a party that will embrace wine tasting and have some peoples bring their favorite wines, breads, and cheeses to help accommodate. Come on peeps, use your imagination here. Let me know in the comments below if you have anything special you do during fall festivities, or if you have some good ideas even. Vines are also very important and have heavy symbolism during this season. Many of our witchy friends will create wreaths from empty vines symbolizing a successful harvest and of course the ever-turning wheel of the year. I myself have multiple wreaths I've created through many of the seasons, but especially during the fall harvest. One wreath, after created, can be redecorated and applied to all of the other sabbats. Failing to make your own, most any arts and crafts store will sell a variety of wreaths, many different sizes, specifically designed for being able to decorate them to your liking. Garland is another type of vine that held heavy influence, especially in Ireland. The Irish had one particular festival called Garland Sunday that was observed the first Sunday in September. In this tradition, garlands were constructed from native vines and apples by the village's unmarried women and taken by them, along with all the unmarried men, to a local churchyard. Once at the churchyard, the garland was broken up and strewn about the graves amidst crying and moaning for the dead. It's believed that this tradition is in fact carried over from our ancestors making long processions during this time to honor the dead. After this particularly depressing act was accomplished, it was of course followed up with feasting, dancing, and merriment. Such celebrations involving cemeteries during this time span many cultures including Mexico, Central America, China, Hong Kong, Korea, Vietnam, and Thailand. The autumn equinox is not only a time when night and day are equal, but also it's a time when all things are in balance for one brief moment. The god and goddess are thought to have equal power on this night, as well as the forces of good and evil. In nearly all Native American and Polynesian traditions, rattles were made from autumn nuts. These rattles' hulls were colorfully painted with symbols and markings that reflected medicinal sigils and symbology, as well as decorated with feathers and beads that were meaningful for specific purposes. Rattles were used to frighten away evil spirits and drive out sickness, also to cleanse ritual spaces and honor and invite ancestors of the dead to participate in rituals. Some shamans would possess multiple rattles for multiple purposes and multiple celebrations. The fall equinox, unlike its counterpart Ostara, the spring equinox, it's a time for beginning to reflect inwards, as again opposed to Ostara when one begins to reflect outwards for the coming summer months. Inward reflection is prominent here to go within as the darker, colder months of death begin to cloud around us. At this time, a horn of plenty also takes great symbology. It's both a phallic symbol, and when stuffed with fruits and vegetables of the harvest, it represents a womb gushing forth its autumn bounty. So with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of Witch into Working. How do you celebrate the Autumnal Equinox, or Mabon for some of us? Do you give a sort of thanksgiving to the gods during this time? How do you share festivities with family and friends? Please let us all know in the comments below. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to ring that little bell to remind you of any and all future episodes to come. I love you guys and gals, and I look forward to spending some time with you on the next video. Happy Mabon, Autumnal Equinox, whatever you decide to call it in your humble witchy world, and blessed be. Love you.